Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's episode of the Through Their Eyes podcast. I'm super excited about today's episode. I think we have an awesome guest, especially getting into the holiday season, about giving back to our community. And first things first, I want to remind everybody you can call in at 919-518-9773 or on Skype at computers2kvoice.com, or not .com, just computers2kvoice. Please feel free to join the live chat to ask any questions you'd like at nissancommunications.com. And with that being said, I want to
.net
let me
dot
first introduce my co-host Emily, and we can get into our awesome guest for today.
Hello,
.net
everyone.
nissancommunications.net. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Emily. Happy holidays. I want to say that first. I hope you guys are enjoying this time off with your families, friends, or your just loved ones. And I'm a college student over here in Baltimore. And let's get into today's episode. Let's introduce our guest.
All right, hello. My name's Zac Levy. So nice to meet you all. And I don't know, I guess we're starting the podcast.
Yeah, so just for a quick, brief description, and then we can definitely get into your story, Zach. Zach is only 17 years old and the author of the book Project Unhoused, which chronicles his time that he's been working on this project over the course of the last year to help gain insight into homelessness and what makes people go homeless. He's been doing amazing work for the community. And I think to start off, Zach, can you just go ahead and give us a little bit of a brief story around the kind of work you've done and how you got to this point?
Yeah, so I've spent the last year and a half now interviewing homeless individuals, trying to understand how they became homeless, like you were saying, but focusing on it through a human lens, looking at their stories, not just the final straw that led to them becoming homeless, but the whole mosaic of their lives. And really from birth, what sort of factors played in to their eventual fall into homelessness. So I started the project after a formative experience where me and my father were at a 7-Eleven, and there was a girl, I guess, a few years older than me, maybe 18, 19 at the time, who clearly couldn't afford what she was trying to buy. My father stepped in front, paid for her, and when we left the store, we saw that she was just sitting on the street with some meager belongings. And I was just so confused how at that age she could end up living on the streets, homeless. So I started doing research when I got home, and I kept finding articles that pointed to the last thing that led to people becoming homelessness. So it could be mental health, drug addictions, alcohol addictions, but they didn't look into what happened before that. So founded Project House to try to understand this whole um, perspective of people's entire lives, not just the final straw that broke the camel's back.
I feel like there's a broad spectrum of factors that kind of lead to homelessness, and I don't know too much about it, but I do remember reading on it a couple years ago and hearing that, like typically when people imagine homelessness, they imagine somebody like sleeping on the streets when in reality it can look much more different than that, like staying at a motel or staying at, jumping from motel to motel or sleeping in your car. I guess the colloquial term is like couch surfing, things like that. So, um, yeah, I think it's just one of those things where it's not as black and white as it's made out to be. So I
Yeah,
Yeah,
think,
so
and
in
go ahead, Zach. Go
yeah,
ahead, 100%.
yeah, so in some of my interviews, there were people who didn't even realize were considered homeless until years later. There was an older woman who's now 90 who was living in a motel for almost 2.5 years before her and her son couldn't afford to even live in the motel anymore. And she didn't even realize that at that stage she could start qualifying for benefits because she really was considered homeless.
I mean, beyond that, actually, Zach, I'm just curious for myself. What kind of benefits can you qualify as being considered homeless? Because I didn't know much about the systems we have in place around that.
Yeah, so it really depends on which state. So I'm from New Jersey. I should have mentioned that at the beginning. The podcast, Josh is from North Carolina. Is that right?
Yeah.
So in New Jersey, there's lots of different benefits. There's some of the people I interviewed had disabilities. One of the women who I interviewed had was deaf in one ear, so she qualified only at that point for short term, but she was working to get long-term disability. Um, Depending on your age, there's obviously Social Security. Some of the people I interviewed were already further into their lives and qualified for Social Security. There's food stamps, there's all different programs. But the majority of the help that I found in all of the conversations I was having with different organizations is that um, really it's the faith-based and the community-based organizations in an area that pick up most of the slack. The government provides some money, but in most cases, it's not really enough. One of the people I interviewed, her and her daughter qualified for, I think, $25 in food stamps a month, which not enough to buy anything. So she worked with organizations to have meals every week, and that's really what allowed her to keep surviving in these circumstances. So it's depends.
Yeah, and beyond that too, I'm really sorry. I'm super interested about this. You brought up prior to this that you wanted to know what makes people homeless before like all these things. And I'm assuming that was your mission with Project Unhoused. As a teenager, right? Like as we're still high schoolers thinking about our future, did you learn any stories about like significant choices that teenagers made or that people made in their younger years that are beyond just like what the media says, drugs, alcohol, all that, but beyond that, that led them to this position?
I'm trying to think about like big life decisions at that age. What I found is that most of the major factors were prior to that even, which was interesting. It was about first of all, some things were even before you were born. A mother's nutrition, the environment that you're born into affects the way that you view the world. If you're constantly in danger and so hyper alert as to what's happening around you, you don't really focus on the future. So if you're just trying to figure out where your next meal is going to be, you're not focusing on what is going to happen next week. You're focusing on tonight. You're focusing on an hour from now. So that translates later in life. In terms of around our age, in high school and college age, people who I interviewed really were either set on a direction before then, but also it was a different time period. The people who I really delved into that period for them. Oh, actually, no, I have one good story from that period. One of the people I interviewed, his name's James Alay. I believe he was the third interview in the book, and he wanted to go into film as a high schooler. When he was a senior in high school, though, his parents got divorced, and his father took all the money and left, so he had to enter the workforce. So he started working as a at a fast food restaurant, and things continued from there. But I guess that would be the major change in high school. There wasn't really a lot.
All right, awesome. And I mean, Emily, I don't know what kind of thoughts that like get that like spewed for you, but I mean, did you have anything you want to add on to that?
Actually, yeah. When you mentioned Zach, what is it, factors even from before you were born, I want to ask how how the cycle of poverty ties into that because I know that what is it, individuals who are born into poverty are more likely to remain in poverty. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that, or if you've seen anything that kind of substantiates that statement.
Yeah, so I saw a lot with regards to cyclical natures and people not being born in situations that could set them up for a successful future. So, ignoring just monetary concerns and nutritional concerns, one of the biggest things I found was something called self-regulation, which is a psychological term where someone just learns how to regulate their emotions. Sorry, self-regulation. It's the ability to control one's emotions when something is upsetting, being able to move on, not being overly upset, not having what we would usually deem as just anger problems or um, getting too stuck up on sad occurrences. If you aren't able to self-regulate, anything that happens negative in your life can really get you stuck and can be hard to overcome. So in the real way that people learn this skill of self-regulation is through their family and through their community. So when people who grow up in poverty or with absent parents or parents with mental health issues, they aren't always taught these important abilities about how to lead their life, and they aren't set up for success in an emotional stance. So James Alley, who I was talking about before, what ended up happening to him is his father was negligent as he was growing up. His mother had um, a mental health disorder. I can't remember the exact term. Oh, sorry, agoraphobia. I'm not sure if you know what that means. It's pretty much what that meant in his childhood is that they wouldn't go too far from home. She's afraid of being too far from places that she knows, so they would never go past the supermarket. So very like insular, not really getting to know too many people. So he wasn't taught the real abilities that we learn through our parents, through our communities, through our teachers, about how to handle our emotions. So when he eventually started working as in a fast food restaurant, he had three terrible occurrences in quick proximity that just knocked him out. He wasn't able to recover emotionally, and he ended up using drugs to cope.
Yeah, and
I
Zach, I
remember.
mean, oh, Emily. Okay, I'll take it. I'll take it. Yeah,
Yeah, go
so
ahead.
this is what I'm really curious about, Zach. When you just brought up this story about James, for example, and I think the reason this sticks out to me so much is I still remember maybe like a year ago, I'm scrolling through YouTube or something, and you see a video like a homeless person shares what they want the world to know. And I think a big theme in those videos is that it feels like, and I think this is almost a point you were even trying to get at with your book, which is why when I saw the article about it, it really stuck out to me is that there's a story they really want to tell, but they just don't have the position or the privilege to be able to tell that story. And so, like, when you bring up James's story right now, right, you're providing us with a context that I would have never thought about prior, you know? And we even touched on this a bit in the last podcast episode we did, which talked about drugs and all, is that these people, when they get stuck in these situations, I think there's a lot of stigmatization that happens. Like if you do drugs, it's automatically your fault, you know? When
Yeah,
so many other factors, like in the case of James, for example, I can't blame him if his mom had this issue that set him up in the wrong way.
yeah.
What do you feel in these conversations? A, did you feel like there was a message that, and if you have any interview that sticks out to you, please feel free, but did you feel like there was a message that someone really wanted the world to know in one of your interviews? And if so, like, what was that message? What do you think, as an audience, the people you interviewed would want us to know about them?
A great question. So I'm just going to take it from a bit of a different approach, and I'll get to the main crux of the question. Um, what I was trying to do by interviewing people is to share the humanity behind this issue. Like you were saying, there's so much stigma, there's so much people just pointing blame, saying it's not my fault, it's his fault. He started using drugs, he shouldn't have. But there's things before that, which is what I was talking about with self-regulation and different things that could happen growing up that set people up on this path where I was saying, I don't know if I'd be able to make it through that sort of problem given what he had. You're just set up in a path where it's like, how do you overcome that? So almost all of the people who I interviewed just wanted to share their story. They just loved to talk to people because in talking about it, they were working through the problems that they had faced. James specifically, this was he had just started his recovery process. He was clean for about 3 months at the time, and it was the first time that he really um, looked back through his life, tried to recount everything that happened, and started putting pieces together. So it was just so interesting to see the gear spinning in his brain as he was just figuring things out on the fly as well. But yeah, everyone had their own things that they wanted to focus on. The biggest common thread in terms of message to the world, I'd say, is just how content people were with so little, right? You don't have to have everything to be happy. One of the people who I interviewed, her name is Rose. She's 90 years old, living in her truck, homeless, for a few months now. And she was the happiest person I think I've ever met. She was so content with just living. And she loves to read, she loves to knit. She just finds uses of her time. And she just became homeless because she wasn't her son wasn't making enough money to support the family after her husband died. She worked her entire life as a data analyst, was collecting Social Security by no fault of her own. Things led down this path, and it was just so sad, but it was so uplifting to see the way that she was rolling with the punches and continuing to make the most of her life. That's what I say is the most lasting message.
And then, Emily, if you had anything to say, feel free to interject.
No,
Um,
say that
okay.
that kind of reminded me of like I'm not sure if you guys have ever seen these, but I've seen like on my For You page these like TikTok interviews where like guys will like interview like I think there's just one particular one where it's like called like Stories from the Streets, I believe, and like he interviews like different individuals who experience homelessness, and I don't know, I guess it's
Write
kind
that
of like
down.
sorry?
I want to write that down. I haven't heard of that. Stories from the
Oh,
streets.
yes, I believe that's what it's called. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty
I'll
sure
look it up.
I've seen like a couple of those because sometimes I like them and then naturally they just come up because the algorithm. But I remember there was this like one young lady, like and that kind of like you saying the 90-year-old lady being so content with so little kind of reminded me of that one particular story. I remember it very loosely, so I'm not gonna try to articulate the details because I'm probably gonna completely
Hmm.
butcher it. But it just kind of like it just reminded me of that. And then I feel like there's so many depictions of homelessness in the media, like through what is it? The Pursuit of Happiness, that movie with Will Smith and then Jaden. And then I don't know if you've ever seen the Netflix series like The Maid, where it's that single mother and trying to like provide for her daughter. And then even in massive TV shows like Shameless. I know you mentioned agoraphobia, and I remember there was one character named Sheila who had agoraphobia. And I guess what I'm trying to say with all of this is, what is it? This is a completely different like side point, but I was just curious about what is it, your answer on this. Is there any media, like movie, film, video, whatever it may be, that you felt was like an accurate depiction of, a real story that could possibly be a real story? Because of course we know that what is it? The media tends to kind of exaggerate things, but I was just curious if you ever seen something and thought, wow, like that kind of reminds me of something real that I've seen.
So I don't watch a lot of movies or TV, so I don't have anything. But in one of my interviews, Ellen, I think it was the seventh interview, she mentioned she became homeless after Hurricane Sandy, which was a really big hurricane that happened in New Jersey about a decade ago, that destroyed most of the coast. Personally, I wasn't that affected. I was really young, but it really devastated major parts of New Jersey and New York. And she mentioned that there was a film about Hurricane Katrina that she watched a few years back, and it very much reminded her of her own experiences. So I think I have it written down somewhere, but it'll take me a little while to find it. I'll let you know.
Yeah.
I mean, that's so cool, Zach. I think that adding on to what we were talking about, sharing these experiences as well. Emily brought up like movies and media, which I'm about to divert a little bit from that point. But I mean, I was really touched by the story you just talked about with the 90-year-old woman, right, who is so content with her life. And it's not like a story of someone that's content without ever having anything in the first place. Like she's seen it all and she's like living this like frugal lifestyle and still enjoying it. And maybe I'm just bringing this up because it's the holiday season, right? But when you take kids and you take people that have never experienced this sort of loss before, I think it's really easy for people, I don't like to say the word spoiled. That's very bad because this includes me. I still remember being a kid. All I cared about was my Christmas gifts, right? But I think that when as you grow older, people compare more and more and more. And then you take somebody, like let's say somebody who's in a homeless situation where so many people, they're always comparing themselves to people who have way better than them. They don't see the other side of the coin of these people who have it way worse, right?
Yeah.
But now you brought up a really good point. Who's to say they have it worse? Potentially, they could be happy. And I know we kind of touched on it, but I guess, adding on to that, I really want to know your thoughts. Like, what do you think they were doing right? The people that you found were the happiest out of those in your interviews. What do you think they were doing that people that have everything just don't do? And that's what leaves them sad and depressed and lonely.
It's a mindset thing. All of the people who I interviewed and they were just so happy with their life were, at least I'm thinking about two specifically. I'm not sure if it's all, but they were very religiously inclined. Um, those two specifically. And I'm thinking about Larry as well, who was the first interview, who had a terribly hard life, but his perspective was just so uplifting as well. And I forgot his exact motto. I have it written down in the book, but it was I don't remember exactly, but it was a religious idea that he said, and that's what helped him get through tough times. Rose also said that her community at her church has been very helpful and uplifting, and a few other people mentioned that as well. But I think it might not have to be religion, just having a community, people who support you. Because at the end of the day, social interaction, emotional connection is really what makes people happy. It's not just physical and the newest iPhone or whatever. Like, I don't even care.
I think
And
it's also
yeah,
yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
no,
off.
you can continue.
Oh, I was gonna say, I think it might also be like the simplicity of it all, from my own opinion, just because I personally have never experienced homelessness, but I'm a first generation, what is it, student. So my parents, they were immigrants, and I still have family in like my home country who live in poverty. And it's funny because people over there that kind of idolize the United States and they kind of see it as almost this land of wealth, or they have a hard time kind of conceptualizing that people experience poverty or homelessness over here. But I've also had family members who have come over here, who have worked here and have been at this country for a couple of years, the country that everybody seems to idolize, and then they go back. And then they're like, well, I just didn't like it. And then I think largely it's because they enjoy the simplicity of the life over there, because you don't necessarily get fixated on arbitrary things like, what is it? Like all of these just like over exaggerated beauty standards or social media, just really arbitrary things. I think they enjoy the simplicity of being able to get up every day and do the things that you need to do, and then also just be able to like enjoy the scenery or go for a walk. You don't necessarily get lost in the minutia of the things that we tend to over here. But that's just
Yeah.
my
And I think you're making an awesome point, Emily. Like, I know we're getting sidetracked, but that's the point, to get like just have a nice conversation. I think that what happens a lot of the time nowadays is that I think that we have some core desires, right? Just as human beings, like almost like as animals, to just connect with people, to not to live almost free of responsibility, right? That's why people kind of reminisce on their childhood days when they didn't have responsibilities. And while progress is important, in an attempt for constant progress, like the innovation that we see today, sometimes we lose an appreciation for like the simple things in life, right? And we'll definitely get back onto those points too, Zach. But I think that one of the
No, this
most
is completely
important
on
things.
topic.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. I'm glad that you can like we can even correlate this because I'm hoping that even the people you talk to, the people that you saw, like this is what they want people to learn to appreciate again. It even gets into the whole scheme of how in within like the capitalism, and I'm 100% a huge supporter of innovation, right? Working on technology for the future. That's stuff I'm passionate about. But people only think about the dream car, the dream house, and it just becomes a game when what really matters, is like you said, the ability to just appreciate little things in life. And I think that the people that you met and these people that are homeless that you've interviewed, living in that simplicity, and I guess this could turn to a question for you too. Do you think, or did you hear anybody say, because I feel like I would maybe assume they would, that people think they have it worse than they actually do? Like people look at them and feel more pity than what they feel is warranted. Were there any situations like that?
Yeah, I don't think that ever actually came up. It's interesting. I didn't think to ask that. Um, but back to what you were saying before, I think there's a certain difference between innovation and consumerism, which is I'm not an expert on the topic at all, but consumerism is just constantly wanting to buy the newest thing, focusing on just purchasing things, which is what American culture is really about. It's what fuels our economy. Just um, factories need to have the demand.
that kind of
So yeah,
I took an Eastern religions class last semester, and I believe this is a doctrine from the Buddhists, where I don't think this is what they said verbatim, but it's essentially something to the tone of desire is the root of unhappiness, which I think is really applicable to the situation. And I just wanted to interject and say that in relation to simplicity and consumerism.
Yeah. Yeah, so these people who don't have the money to just purchase things are happier in a way because they aren't focused on that. They're not focused on just looking the best. They're not out buying clothes. They're just doing the bare essentials. They want good hygiene and they don't really care about being excessive, which is a good lesson to learn.
I mean, and yeah, I'm so sorry. Once Emily brought up like religions, I just remembered this was a thought I had. And I think it can go back to the simplicity too, but do you know, and I have no clue if this really got brought up in like your book, and if it didn't, I wouldn't mind you also just elaborating more on what you think the focus was of your book. But was there ever anybody who's brought their religion into question because of what ended up happening to them? Like when bad things happen to people, sometimes it's our faith gets put to the test. Did anybody like struggle with religion because of
Oh,
their
100%.
situation?
100%. Yeah. So I feel bad I keep going back to James because there's so many interviews, but James specifically, I'll just give a little bit more information because I sort of brushed over before. But the three things that happened to him, in close succession, God, I gotta talk. Um, he was at a bar just drinking socially with some friends. Someone went up to him, asked for a cigarette. He went into his pocket to get it. They sucker punched him. He was knocked out. His jaw was really damaged. He went back to the hospital. They started giving him morphine for the pain, which will come up in a second. A few months later, he didn't explain the details, and it sort of seemed like a sore topic, so I didn't want to talk about it. But there was some sort of discussion between him and his younger brother. He was very, very close to his younger brother. I think they were like 4 or 5 years apart, but they were best friends forever. And there was a discussion over who should drive to Philadelphia. I don't know the reasons why, but James was supposed to drive. His brother ended up doing the drive instead, and he died in a car accident on the way there. So after that, he put his religion into question. His brother was extremely religious. I think he was a born again Christian. And it was just he had his own problems before, but he was very religious now, and he'd helped him through them. But it was just such a shock to him, and this is where he didn't have that ability to self-regulate and make it through this intense trauma one after the other. He started using morphine not only for the pain of his jaw, but to self-medicate, to not have to think about these problems. And then a few months later, Hurricane Sandy hit, and they lost their apartment. So that was the final straw. So yeah, lots of people talked about religion being put into question, but a few people, specifically Ruth, who was the eighth interview, the last interview, um, she had a terrible upbringing, abusive parents, just it's hard to even recount. And religion was really the thing that allowed her to make it through. She contemplated suicide at many points in her childhood, and it was religion that made her really push through. And she ended up recovering, getting married, having children. And only when she was in her 60s did something happen again that led to her becoming homeless. So it's just religion can take either aspect. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
it goes to show that perspective is really everything. That kind of reminds me of something that I learned in my psych class last semester, like external locus of control versus internal locus of control, where I feel like, well, external locus of control is essentially where you believe that external factors kind of dictate your destiny, and then internal is more so you believe that your actions and your personal choices impact your destiny. So I think it kind of like, I feel like it's kind of applicable with James, for example. He's more external because he's like, well, this happened because like God let it, it's like why would God let this happen to me? Whereas with Ruth, it may be like a situation where she more so aligns herself with, I guess, sentiments like, well, I can do all things through Christ, like that sort of belief. And I think it's really interesting to see how perspective is just relative and everyone thinks differently and everyone just kind of feels differently about a situation, even though it may be the same situation that they're in.
Mhm.
And I'm adding on to Emily's point too. I mean, from my perspective, right? I've not gone through some horrible thing that like has made me question my religion deeply. But I think faith is a lot of it too. Actually, in fact, you brought up the eighth interview with Roof, and I think I might be curious to ask a follow-up question on that. I feel like your religion and your faith gets deeply ingrained with you, like how your upbringing is. And I don't know, like how, whether you're religious or not. And I don't, you can go into the details if you want, of course. But I think the point I'm trying to get at is in someone like Ruth's situation where she had a negligible upbringing, did you ever learn how she discovered religion? How God like made her way, their way into her life?
Think her family was outwardly religious, even though they were physically and sexually abusive towards her. They um, inside of her family, they were not great people at all. They were terribly abusive, but I guess they might have been outwardly abusive and, or sorry, outwardly religious and pretended like they were good people to the community. She said some things later that made it sound like they cared about the reputation. Um, so I don't know. I think it was just such a disciplinarian background or upbringing that she took what they said as law. Um, I
And
don't know.
on
I didn't ask about that either, but I did ask in most of my interviews how religion played into their lives. And most people grew up religious and had moments where they questioned it, but it was eventually strengthened. And through faith, that's really how they got to where they are.
Mhm. And how did they strengthen it? Do you know? Like, was it was there ever like a special moment, like it was meant to be kind of thing that got them back to that belief?
So many of the people who I interviewed hadn't really thought back when they were living in it. The people who are on drugs, your mind is so clouded, you can't really process um, anything of that nature. But when they are in the recovery process now, after being clean for a few months, they start to think more lucidly, and now they're realizing all the things that they're so thankful for. The people who I spoke to, many of almost all of them, I think, who would use drugs had overdose incidents where thankfully they survived. One person had, I think, two. Yeah, James specifically, he went into recovery after almost overdosing, um, and it's just that sort of realization, and it's hard to deny something as miraculous as surviving an overdose.
Yeah, I mean, that's an awesome point. Our last interview, we talked a lot with these like UNC Chapel Hill students that worked in the Carolina Harm Reduction Union. And their whole thing was about overdoses. Like they work towards distributing medicines and things of that nature to help, combat overdose and protect students. And now that we're getting this like full spectrum of, how people perceive there's stigma not only on people that do drugs, but people that are homeless. I just think that it's like so awesome that these points can kind of like connect with each other because it gives more insight too. I think, you will see it at a basic level in high school. You'll see it at a larger and larger level as you grow older that people fall into bad habits and it just is an inevitability in which once you fall into the bad habit it just compounds more and more bad things happen to you that will just press the bad habit and it'll just stick. And I mean even in this case, right, you took, I think the James story is really powerful. I mean, I'm sure during that interview it really like hit you
Yeah.
too, that even to the fact that you brought it up so much because he's gone through so much, and to get to that point where they're still here today recovering and fighting, it's just such a powerful story to me. I mean, I think it's super meaningful. I don't have any follow-up question to that. I just thought that was really insightful. Emily, if you had anything you want to add on, that'd be awesome.
No, I was gonna say I agree. Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't know. I guess getting into maybe this might be unless you had something you wanted to bring up, by the way, Zach. But like adding on to a different starter, I think. Can you just give us like what was like another story from one of the interviews you haven't brought up yet, where it kind of had a different theme or a different message that you think could be important today that people should hear that are listening to the show?
I got it. Okay. I think I'll take a few minutes to think about that. I'll talk about something else while I'm trying to come up with one. One of the things I wanted to talk about is We talk a lot about the causes of homelessness, and it's something that I've heard a lot of people just say it's mental health, it's drug abuse, it's alcohol addictions. Um, Something that I thought was really interesting is that not only did I not find this to be the root cause, I also found that in the way that we're fighting the issue, this is a real it's getting in our way. So many of the organizations that I talked to and researched were specifically for people who had these problems. They were either doubled as rehabs or as psychiatric hospitals. So people who never had any problems with drug abuse or mental health or alcohol addiction were not able to access that same degree of help. So when you're talking about before what exists for the people who don't have any problems and never really fell into these bad habits, there isn't nearly as much. So the three people who I interviewed who never touched drugs or never had alcohol addictions, didn't have mental health problems, were the people who weren't actively being helped, even though they were working with great organizations who are trailblazing, trying to find solutions for people. It's just the this misconception is reflected in the way that we're fighting the issue on the ground, and it was just so heartbreaking to see that. And that's a main goal of the project, to educate people so that we don't have these inefficiencies in the system due to lack of education.
There's a lot of hurdles I feel that people face, when they're already in homelessness as they're actively experiencing it. I'm not sure if this is still applicable today, but I remember, I think this is about a decade ago. I don't even know why I remember this conversation I had with one of my family members, but she had read this book about this family that was homeless and how, what is it? The family's being separated because the mother and their child had to go to a women and children's shelter, whereas the dad had to be separated from them and had to go to a men's only shelter. And I'm not sure if that's still the setup today, but from what I remember, like largely institutions were kind of divided by like women and children and then men. So like families that were homeless sometimes might be, like dissevered from one another. And then there's something else I wanted to mention too. Oh, I also want to ask how homelessness looks different during seasonal changes. Like I imagine, of course, during the winter it's so much more like difficult, whereas like in the summer, like that heat or like the warmth of the climate isn't necessarily as perilous on your body as cold is.
Yeah, so I kept noticing in like my first few interviews, all of like the crazy stories started with it was a cold winter night, it was below freezing, and we just needed to find a place to sleep. So I started doing research. There's actually a program specifically in New Jersey called Code Blue, on all nights that are below freezing. There's just a coalition of areas across the state that have what they call warming centers, where they just open up their doors, no restrictions, anyone could come in. And that's just incredible. I don't know about North Carolina specifically. I've never been. I don't know about the climate there. But specifically in New Jersey in the winter, there's lots of programs like that. About families, a couple of the programs that a couple of the directors I spoke to with local nonprofits have programs specifically for families. So there's a organization near me called Interfaith Neighbors, and they have a program specifically for homeless or low-income families where they give the parents jobs, they take care of the children. They actually have a home building um, program that people donate lots, and they sort of like Habitats for Humanity. They build homes, and there's lots of programs that I saw for full family. So I don't know if that's still the same dynamic. I didn't interview any full families. But what I did find is that at least in New Jersey, or in my area specifically in Monmouth County, there is no women's homelessness shelters. There was only men's and families. There was no just single woman. Um, there's an organization called the Women's Hospitality Network for Women Fleeing Domestic Abuse that is a coalition of churches that take people night to night during the winter. So during the winter nights, it's extremely hard to be out on the street. So they have this 3 to 4 month program, but for the majority of the year, there really isn't much. So that's one major gap that I found near me. I didn't I don't know about in North Carolina or on a wider scale than that.
I
Yeah, I
mean,
like
adding on to that too, like, I think that's so awesome that in New Jersey they're doing all these things. Like, but you did bring up a good point too, right? You were talking earlier about like drugs and alcohol and how sometimes organizations feel like that's the only problem or like the only thing they have to fix. Are there any changes that you would like to see? And I don't know how far you're going to take this project going forward, but are there any changes that you'd like to see that you think that more like volunteering organizations should implement?
So I did a full chapter on an organization called the John Bon Jovi Soul Kitchen. They call themselves a community restaurant. They've just a brilliant plan where the whole idea is anyone can dine there. Anyone is welcome, food insecure, homeless, anyone. And regular people go as well. And they make it completely anonymous as to who's paying and who's not. And if you want, after you eat, you could donate a meal for another person. And it's just a bonding experience between people from different backgrounds to have conversations, to break bread, literally. And then also it supports people who are food insecure. It was created by John Bon Jovi, who's a musician, a rock and roll musician in New Jersey, and has done a lot, especially in the tri-state area. And this was just an organization that he founded, I think, at least a decade ago, and it's just been incredible. There's a few locations across New Jersey. And about the scope of the project going forward, this is just the beginning. This was the research phase, and now we're starting implementation. So I already started. I've spoken a little bit about Rose, who's the 90-year-old woman who's had a just incredibly difficult life. We started a program, an annuity program, giving $100 a month to her, and we're going to be starting with a few other people who I interviewed. And all of the money from the book and all donations are going directly back to the homeless and different efforts. I'm doing a winter clothing drive throughout the winter. I set up locations across my county by working with my local city council, and we're going to be doing distributions of winter clothing in my community. So we have lots of things planned, and this is really only the beginning.
Bon Jovi's initiative reminds me of something because I know that LA has a huge homelessness
Yeah.
problem, and it reminds me that Jaden Smith, I think he started this vegan food truck a couple of years ago, specifically for homeless individuals. And it's like completely free food and it's, like I said, plant-based. And I think that initiatives like that are just really great. And I think honestly there should be more of them because ultimately everybody is a human being and everybody deserves to eat. Like there's just no doubt about that. You know what I mean? Like unequivocally that is true. And yeah, I think it just sucks that there are people who don't know where the next meal is going to come from. And yeah, I think we should have more initiatives like that for sure.
And I was just so surprised as I started learning more about how many of these initiatives were privately funded versus government funded. Because what the government does really is just not enough to survive, just frankly. People who I were talking to were just not receiving enough in government benefits to survive a month on food. They just weren't getting enough food. So it was really up to the community and faith-based organizations who were doing the hard work on the ground, making sure that everyone has a meal.
Yeah, it sucks that our governments aren't doing enough, but it's beautiful to see that like individuals take it upon themselves to help their fellow man. I think it almost kind of restores your faith in humanity in a way just to see
Yeah.
just the average civilian, care so much about someone that they may not even know enough to actually go out of their way and dedicate time to feeding these people or clothing them or, providing them with resources.
Yeah, and actually, something I wanted to add on too, because I think that even though this might be a little bit like of a not touchy subject, but this might come across as like a sensitive topic. When we address people doing their part, right? And we talk about people helping, and I'd love to definitely hear your opinion on this, Zach. I think that there's a lot of people too that have this mindset, and maybe, and it's not their fault. It's almost, it can be an ignorance if depending on how you were raised. But some people have this mindset that people that are, and we've talked about this, in a homeless situation have brought it upon themselves. That it was, and I think I'll get to the point, but this is really what your book is analyzing at that human side, right? They don't feel an obligation to help because they just think that this person did it to themselves. Or these people think I worked hard, so I'm not in this position. This person didn't work hard, so they're in this position, which is obviously a very deteriorating and degrading thing for somebody who is homeless to hear, especially with all the circumstances that you brought up. If you were in a room right now filled with an audience of these people that just think that I'm not obligated to help the homeless, it's their fault they're in that situation, what would your almost like in a court, what would your case be? What would be your argument based off what you've learned and your interviews as the evidence for why these people deserve empathy? They deserve, obviously, at a human level, they do. But when we're addressing the people that think in that way, what would your court case be? What would your argument be?
Yeah, so I've spoken a lot about a bunch of the different interviews that have had these sort of stories where I just can't say that it's their fault. There's nothing that I think they could have done differently that would have allowed them to weather this storm. I've spoken about Rose and how she did everything right. She worked from when she graduated high school until she was 65 and retired, and she just wasn't making enough money. She had no poor financial decisions. Her son is working a pavement, and he just wasn't getting enough jobs. And slowly and slowly, they just had to sell their house. They got an apartment and they couldn't afford rent, and they went to a motel, and then they couldn't even afford that motel. So it's just how do you say that this 90-year-old woman should do anything differently or should have done anything differently to not end up in the situation? Even if she was able to get a job, which so many people say, just get a job, work hard, you could get out of it. In many cases, getting a job actually lowers the amount of benefits that you're getting from the government to a point where it's not even worth it. By working every day, you're making less at the end of the month because as soon as you're past a certain level, you're not getting anything from the government anymore. And there's a big gap between the maximum the minimum income that the government helps with and the actual income that you need to survive, especially in New Jersey. I don't remember the statistics for North Carolina or other states off the top of my head, but the main difference is that the government, there's a federal level for poverty and there's a state level for poverty, and the government helps based off the federal level, not the state level. So it's not individualized to where you are and how much you actually need to survive. So even if you're working really hard, you could not be making enough at the end of the month. And how do you combat a point like that where it's just like this person did everything right and is now living on the street?
And I think that actually evaluates another great point because, living in New York costs so much more than living in North Carolina, for example. And if somebody is stuck living in New York and, you can't afford to move to a completely different state, how are they gonna take care of themselves if they're being treated like they're also, the same benefits and the same way as somebody who lives in a different state that's very small and rural and needs a lot less money to survive? But I think the point you're addressing is super strong. I don't have much to add on to that. Emily, if you've got anything you want to say, feel free.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, the cost of living in different states ultimately, like, kind of impacts, what is it, the risk of homelessness. And this kind of reminded me of the statistic, or just like the general, like, I believe this is like a known fact that, like, I think it's like 60 some percent of US individuals are like one paycheck away from, like, what is it, homelessness or not homelessness. But either way, it's like, what point am I trying to make with this? That either way, it's like, I think sometimes, like, some people who stereotype homeless individuals don't really realize that they are much closer to homelessness than, what is it, than the 1%, of course. So I think it's like, it's just not, like, people shouldn't be as judgmental towards individuals who are homeless, because you never know, what is it, if life can throw unforeseen circumstances towards you. And you could also be in that situation. And at the end of the day, it's like, if you were in that person's shoes, you wouldn't want to be judged. So it's like, you shouldn't shed judgment onto those individuals.
And also,
100%.
Zach, real quick, if you don't mind me adding, do you have I think I saw something somewhere, and I don't know if you still do it, like a GoFundMe page or something where you raise money for Project on House?
Yeah, so we accept donations through GoFundMe. We also have a Venmo link that people can send money to. All the money is going directly back to the homeless and the programs that I mentioned before.
So
And
is there like a link, like a basic link for that, or like what should people look up if they want to donate?
So all of the links are on my website, projectandhouse.com. I don't remember the Venmo at off the top of my head, but everything should be available on my website, projectandhouse.com. You could find my phone number and email address there if you'd like to reach out, have any questions. You'll also find the link to the book and my Venmo page.
Do you have a copy of the book that you could show our audience right now?
Yes, just give me 1 second.
And while Zach is getting that, guys, just a quick reminder while we only have 10 minutes left that you can always call in at 919-518-9773 or on Skype at Computers2K Voice. And feel free to come in and ask questions to us or Zach through the live chat on nissancommunications.net. But yeah, Zach, feel free to show us the book. I'm really excited
Yep.
to see.
Here's a pic. Here's the book, and this is the back.
That's awesome. Do you have a favorite, not, I don't want to ask favorite interview, but do you have like a chapter that you think is like the like core of your book? It really stands for the message.
Yeah, so I've told a few people if you can't read the whole book, the results chapter really goes through everything. It's the longest chapter. I think it's about 20 pages, and I go through summarizing all of the points in a few different questions that I pose at the beginning of the book, and I cite evidence from all the interviews. So even if you don't have the opportunity to read all of them, this summarizes them in a concise way and draws from them to really explain the main points that I found.
Do you mind sharing some of those questions? Like, I'm curious to know just like some
Yeah,
examples.
so it's nothing crazy advanced, just like the basic questions that I had at the beginning. Let me just find the exact ones that I asked. Right, how do people become homeless? So I go through a couple of different things. Sudden disaster. So one of the interviews I didn't have the chance to mention, or did I mention it? Ellen became homeless after Hurricane Sandy, and she was just living paycheck to paycheck, like you were saying about that. Those you said 60% of Americans who are just one paycheck away, and all of a sudden Hurricane Sandy, she couldn't make it to work anymore. There was toxic mold in her apartment, and things just went from bad to worse until she just couldn't find a new place to live and spiraled into homelessness. So that's one that I hadn't even thought about starting the project. I talked about dysfunctional social culture with self-regulation. Some of the other questions are why can't they escape homelessness, which is what we talked about. Sometimes getting a job just hurts you in the long run, things like that. Um, what can be done to help, and then also what can we do to help? So looking at large scale and then also grassroots efforts. Um, and yeah, those are some of the questions that we talked about, but this is really going into depth, drawing upon the interviews in a more meaningful way.
Are you going to continue writing books? Are you going to make this into a series or anything of that sort? Or where do you think you're headed towards with your initiative and your project?
Yeah, so I'm not 100% certain if I'm going to publish another book. For now, I'm thinking I'm going to definitely continue doing interviews, and I plan on posting them on my website in like a blog fashion. And then all the other things that I talk about in the book, my winter clothing drives, the what was I always forget the word, the annuity program, and everything else that I write about is going to be continuing. If no plans to stop. This is just the beginning, and I have a lot more ideas that I hope to implement.
Well, you're doing great work. I'm sure that everyone's looking forward to that. I know I am, and I'm sure Josh is too.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Zach, you go to high school right now, right?
So I'm a senior now.
Okay, yeah. So I'm curious to know, do kids at school know about this? And like, if so, what are their thoughts, you know?
Yeah, I talk to my friends about it a lot. I don't know. I've been asked the question before. I always really struggle to answer it though. It's a conversation topic. It comes up every once in a while in classes. Um,
I mean, is it like something that like your school like talks about a lot, or you just kind of keep it to yourself? It's like your own little thing.
Still a little low key.
so my school is sort of uh, it's a specialized STEM school, so it's more of a engineering math focus, and we have a bunch of different clubs and groups that get a lot of recognition. So it's another thing. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's not like something I don't think the school flaunts.
Yeah, yeah, no. I mean, I guess I was just curious because I do know that I feel like nowadays in different social environments, things like this are perceived very differently. Like you brought up to go to like a specialized STEM school. so that's gonna be a very different environment. But like in my case, I just go to like a random public high school in North Carolina. And I think sometimes, when you find like, because I seriously think what you're doing is super special. Like, you don't see a lot of teenagers doing something like this. When people find like teenagers doing big things like this, it sometimes it's almost like underappreciated, like your peers, they just kind of they don't care too much, people have different perspectives. And I guess I was just, beyond that, how much have you like gotten other friends involved with the project at all, or is it kind of like you just work on it on your own?
Yeah, so one of my friends helped with the distribution. Helped he stayed for the whole time and helped us move everything because he had his dad's van, which is great. I've offered a few friends if they wanted to come, but yeah, it's low key. Just never anything like crazy happened with in conversations or something. It comes up from time to time.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's all I wanted to go with that. And Emily, if you had anything else you want to say.
No, I think that pretty much wraps up my thoughts right now. Yeah.
All right, amazing.
Then with our like final few minutes, Zach, I mean, do you have any big summary points? Like, oh yeah, Marilyn, feel free to talk if you have any questions.
Well, I've been listening and enjoying this immensely, and I've loved how you've gotten off into different conversations about things. Um, but one of the things I wanted to know from you, Josh, and maybe it's because of who I am, is who's supporting you in this? I mean, this takes effort and a lot of work. Is your family involved? And I know your dad. When I listened to your story, I know your dad was with you the first encounter. But I was just curious, like, what's what kind of support do they give you?
Yeah, so
Yeah,
my dad.
so
Oh,
oh yo, you can go ahead first, Zach. I'm really curious to hear.
yeah, so my dad was extremely helpful. He taught me what it's like to be in a meeting environment, and he prepared me for everything. And he was along my side for safety through a lot of the project. So that was really it. My parents were extremely supportive. Also, just the sense of support I got in my community whenever I talked about it with anyone. In school, people went up to me, and like you were saying before, not as much classmates because I also go to public school. It's like a district-wide public school, so people who are in my school aren't really they're like 20 minutes away. So it's not like I see them outside of school, but people in my community came up to me and offered to help, donated clothing. Just so much support came from family and community. And yeah,
It takes a village.
100%,
I mean, I am
100%.
all about people creating that village,
Yeah.
right? And the villages can look lot of different ways. So this has been really cool. I mean, I have loved listening to you. I love the work you're doing, and I loved Josh and Emily's conversation. So kudos, people.
Thank you
All
so
right.
much, Marilyn. Yeah,
Thank you so
so Zach,
much.
I mean, what I guess now we've got 2 minutes left. So I really want to know, like, if you had just like one point you had to make, like this is what you want everybody watching the show, just this was your biggest takeaway from the experience, what would it be? And feel free to go on, like give a little bit of explanation on that. What would that big takeaway be?
Yeah, so we've talked about it so much over the last hour, but it's really that it's not their fault. There's something before that. Like I said before, I felt like in these interviews, I wouldn't have been able to handle these struggles that they had in their situation. They were not equipped socially, emotionally to handle these terrible events that happened to them. And even if they pushed themselves and worked their butt off and got a job, sometimes it would have just landed them deeper. And I wasn't able to identify in many of the interviews anything that um, was like, for example, with Rose, there's nothing that I think she should have done differently. She needed to support her son, and that put her in a compromising financial situation. But family's family. She couldn't cut him off, and they stuck together even into homelessness. And it's not just an easy thing to understand, and it's not just push it aside because it's their fault. It's something that we should all keep on the top of our minds and feel like we have at least some um, not responsibility for, but some ability to help. And yeah, that was the major takeaway.
Well, then I think my final point to that, Zach, is First off, thank you so much for coming on today to share with us. I mean, you're like honestly one of the best guests like that I think I've had, man. Like as a teenager, like teenager to teenager, I know how much work it takes, right? And even having the idea that you can start something this big while you're so young is just like super huge. So kudos to you, obviously. Thank you so much for being with us. My last words to the audience, and then Emily, I'll let you take it away with whatever you want to say, is that please, with Zach's story, take the time to give back during this holiday season. It's the cliche thing you always hear, but especially with the points we made on today's episode, it's really important to understand when you see someone in a worse situation than you, always be kind. And you've heard it since you were a kid, but the reminder is important, knowing that you don't know what put them in that place. So I'll let you take it off, Emily, and then we can wrap it up.
I was gonna say I agree, sayings are coined for a reason, and I want to say that things are not always black and white, and never judge a book by its cover. And always make sure to actually investigate and analyze things before you make a judgment. So yeah.
All right. So, with that, everybody, thank you so much for watching today's episode of Through Their Eyes. I'm not sure what the next guest plan is for the next episode, but I promise we'll have something good. Huge thank you to Zach for coming on today. And we'll see you all later. Thank you guys so, so much.
Everybody.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by StreamingGear.com and DeltaForce.net.